America has been here before, a black man on the asphalt dying at the hands of the police. Convulsive protests across the country. A national reckoning. Vows to change.
The last time was August 2014. Michael Brown was the victim. Darren Wilson was the officer. Ferguson, Mo, was the place.
After the unrest that followed that fatal shooting, police departments spent tens of millions of dollars on body cameras, revised use of force policies and held training sessions in implicit bias and de-escalation. A presidential task force issued 153 recommendations and action items. The Justice Department forced 7 troubled police departments into consent decrees with mandatory benchmarks aimed at reducing racial disparities and police brutality.
6 years after Mr. Brown's body was left on the street for hours, the death of another African-American man, George Floyd, who begged for his life as a Minneapolis officer pressed a knee on his neck, came down like a verdict. The plan to remake American policing has failed.
The Minneapolis Police Department had itself been a beneficiary of that plan, as a pilot site for a federal program to increase trust in the criminal justice system. It had a measurable impact, said David Kennedy, a policing expert who worked on the project, but it absolutely, obviously, transparently wasn't enough.
Attitudes have changed, yes. Police critics have been elected to positions of power. Some departments have decreased arrests, rethought stop and frisk policies and reduced police shootings. There have been successful experiments with diverting people to social services instead of jail.
But top-line numbers, such as the overall count of people fatally shot by the police each year, have not budged. And even when departments pull back from aggressive policing, they often find that stark racial disparities linger, or worsen. A federal after-action report found that the Ferguson police had escalated the tensions there by failing to understand the community's problems and using ineffective and inappropriate tactics like the use of tear gas in unsafe conditions and without warning, tactics that now appear to have proliferated across the country. Despite the renewed urgency every time a black man or woman dies needlessly at the hands of law enforcement, activists have found that the pace of change ranges from slow to glacial. We've had so many working groups. We've had so many recommendations, said Valerie Castile, the mother of Philando Castile, who was fatally shot during a traffic stop in a Minneapolis suburb 2 years after the protests in Ferguson. During an online panel hosted by the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, she added, "I've sat and talked for 4 years, but here I find myself again. The same situation, and I think we've covered everything you could possibly imagine about what we should do and what we could do, but nothing is being implemented." The cycle of good intentions and valiant efforts resulting in marginal improvements has led to calls in recent days to cut funding for police departments or abolish them altogether. But it also leaves open the question of whether the renewed calls for reform after Mr. Floyd's death will lead to lasting change. Even attempts to quantify the problems have come up short. An FBI database tracking the use of force by the police in cases like that of Mr. Brown will be made public for the first time this summer. And though it has taken 5 years to put in place, the tracker includes only 40% of the nation's police officers. A bill introduced this past week by congressional Democrats would require law enforcement agencies to report use of force data. An accounting of deaths in police custody, like that of Mr. Floyd, was mandated by Congress after Mr. Brown died, but it is behind schedule. Despite widespread support, there are still no national standards for police recruitment, training or use of force. But there are reports on top of reports and reforms on top of reforms. The Minneapolis Police Department agreed in recent days to ban chokeholds and require officers to intervene when they see misconduct. But the department had already established a duty to intervene in the years after the shooting in Ferguson. Even before the recent deaths of Ahmaud Arbery near Brunswick, GA, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and Mr. Floyd, experts who have been involved in reshaping police departments were under no illusions that they had made enough progress. Police leaders who aim to make reforms have been stymied by significant obstacles like state laws, union opposition and contractual protections for officers accused of misconduct. Experts say that federal leadership in efforts to improve policing under former President Barack Obama evaporated under President Trump.
Amid concerns about police militarization, the Obama administration reined in a program that gave surplus equipment, including grenade launchers and armored vehicles, to police departments, but Mr. Trump lifted those restrictions.
The Obama administration embraced the use of consent decrees, mandatory, measurable plans overseen by independent monitors, to clean up troubled departments, a tool put in place after the videotaped beating of Rodney King in 1991.
Christy E. Lopez, a former Justice Department official who led police department investigations during the Obama administration, said experience had shown that in many cases nothing short of a consent decree could overcome obstacles like entrenched racism and union opposition.
Even though only a tiny percentage of the nation's 18,000 police departments ever came under a consent decree, they set a tone, established best practices and put police leaders on notice that they, too, could come under scrutiny if they showed a pattern and practice of civil rights violations.
There is something irreplaceable about the leadership of the federal government and the Department of Justice, Ms. Lopez said.
The Trump administration ended the use of consent decrees and significantly curtailed a popular voluntary program, the Collaborative Reform Initiative, which helped departments accomplish goals like reducing officer shootings.
Attorney General William P. Barr has famously attributed police abuses to bad apples and said that criticism of the police was emboldening those who disrespect the law. I don't think that the law enforcement system is systemically racist, he said last Sunday in a television interview.
The move away from consent decrees began after a damning Justice Department report on the Chicago police in 2017 that had been expected to result in aggressive federal oversight. When the Illinois Attorney General, Lisa Madigan, stepped in to place the department under a state consent decree instead, Jeff Sessions, then Mr. Trump's Attorney General, unsuccessfully opposed the move in federal court, despite having said that police oversight should be a state and local responsibility.
Last month, Seattle requested that it be released from the consent decree it has been under since 2012, describing itself as a reformed agency. But it reversed course after the Floyd demonstrations began and after the city received thousands of complaints about the actions of its officers.
Consent decrees have often been frustratingly slow to carry out, with even minor changes like requiring officers to give people business cards meeting with opposition. Still, in places like San Francisco and Chicago, they have had tangible results. In San Francisco, use of force episodes decreased by nearly half between the first quarter of 2016 and the first quarter of this year, and the percentage of subjects of force who were black fell to 37 from 47.
In Chicago, use of force incidents declined between 2015 and 2019, and shootings decreased by almost half. But the proportion of subjects of force who are African American has stayed above 70%, while the city's population is 30% African American.
Experts say the demographic makeup of the general population is not a good benchmark because most people do not interact with the police. One study of fatal police shootings that took criminal activity into account found no overall racial disparity, but said that black victims were more likely to be unarmed and pose no immediate threat, while white victims were far more likely to have provoked the police to harm them, commonly referred to as suicide by cop.
Traffic stops are another way to measure department performance that is not driven by calls for service. 4 years after a New York Times investigation found that the police in Greensboro, North Carolina, were disproportionately pulling over black motorists, the percentage had barely changed, though the total number of stops declined, according to the Open Data Policing Project. The department was more than 4 times more likely to search a black driver than a white driver in 2019, a greater disparity than 4 years before. In both groups the police reported finding contraband a third of the time.
Minneapolis itself is a study in how slow change can be even when leaders want it. The city, known for excessive uses of force against African Americans, had hired 2 successive police chiefs hailed as reformers. The department had given officers training in implicit bias, reconciliation and procedural justice, which focuses on how officers treat the public. The city had overhauled its disciplinary system and invited a federal review of its early intervention system, which is supposed to flag officers who need coaching or more.
Unlike in Ferguson, the officers involved in Mr. Floyd's death were quickly identified and fired, and then criminally charged. But that did not stop days of protest and vows by city council members to dismantle the existing department entirely.
Unions have worked particularly hard at limiting the consequences for officers who use force. Kathy Mitchell, a police reform advocate in Austin, Texas, said that in recent years groups have sought to emphasize de-escalation and moved to narrow the standard under which officers can use deadly force.
But the union fought the effort because officials believed it would put officer lives at risk, said Ken Cassidy, the president of the Austin Police Association.
The result, Ms. Mitchell said, was mixed messages in the policies on de-escalation and use of force.
With every gain that we've made, it has been followed by a period of grinding those gains down through 1,000 cuts, she said.
Members of civilian review boards meant to subject the police to community oversight perennially complain that they are toothless.
In Seattle, Lisa Dugard, a former chair of the city's Community Police Commission, said the panel recommended that the police suspend the use of flashbang grenades to disperse protesters until they could be reviewed. But the department continued to use them extensively, with the police chief saying she would prefer not to, but that officers should have that tool available.
We are used to 100% of our recommendations being ignored, Ms. Dugard said.
In St. Paul, Min, Constance Tuck said she quit her post last year as the chairwoman of the city's Police Civilian Internal Affairs Review Commission after finding that the city was gutting the power of the panel. The mayor's office said it still saw the commission as a vital tool.
In recent days, there has been growing pressure to blunt the power of unions or force them to change. A group of current and former prosecutors called on the State Bar of California to change its ethics rules to prohibit prosecutors, or those campaigning for the job, from seeking or accepting political donations from law enforcement unions.
In Seattle, the King County Labor Council that brings together local unions to advocate as a unit passed a resolution this month saying that the Seattle Police Officers Guild could be kicked out of the group unless it was willing to acknowledge that racism was a structural problem in law enforcement and committed to ensuring that union contracts do not evade legitimate accountability.
But many of the protesters have lost patience with incremental changes. Calls to abolish or defund the police, once a radical solution, have recently been amplified and taken up by elected officials.
Janetta Elzie, a protester, was tear-gassed in Ferguson in 2014 and again last week in Washington, D.C. She has relished the growing calls for reimagining public safety rather than fixing the police. You know, if the training worked, she said, we wouldn't be here.
I've been like having lots of deja vu, she added. Lots.
Lazaro Gamio, Katie Benner and Stephen Moiti contributed reporting.